In the third part, we have seen Mr. Harriet and the inspector going to brick cottages and seeing the miserable condition of a dog called Roy. Roy is never taken care of properly. He's dirty, he has wound in his body. In this video, let us see what are Mr. Harriet and the Inspector Holiday going to do with that poor dog. Let's start.
Of course, and thank you for coming along. Holiday hesitated for a moment, and now I expect you will want to put this poor thing out of his misery right away. I continued to run my hand over the head and ears while I thought for a moment. Yes, I suppose so. We'd never find a home for him in this state. It's the kindest thing to do. Anyway, push the door wide open so that I can get a proper look at him. In the improved light, I examined him more thoroughly. Perfect teeth, well-proportioned limbs, with a fringe of yellow hair. I put my stethoscope on his chest, and as I listened to the slow, strong thudding of the heart, the dog again put his paw on my hand.
As we know that Mr. Harriet accompanied the Inspector Halliday to go to the cottages and see the dog, and therefore the Inspector of RSPCA thanked Mr. Harriet and told him to take out the dog out of shed immediately. Mr. Harriet held the dog and he was moving his hand over the head and ear of Roy and said, "Sir, perhaps in this condition we would never find a home for him." He said to the inspector, "Push the door for opening widely," and the inspector did so. And then there was light, and Mr. Harriet was able to see the dog properly. The dog was staying in the dark shade for a very long time. Here, as the door was open, there was full light inside the shed, and so the author was able to see the dog properly and clearly. As you know that Mr. Harriet is a veterinary surgeon. That's why the inspector of RSPCA had taken him to the shed, to the cottages, the neglected dog, that is Roy, so that he can check the dog, whether the dog is in good condition or not. Here, as the door was open, there was light, and hence Mr. Harriet, as a vet, began to examine him thoroughly. Mr. Harriet had stethoscope, and so he checked his heartbeat with it. What is stethoscope? It's an instrument that a doctor uses to listen somebody's heartbeat and breathing. He could listen the strong thudding of the heartbeat of dog Roy. Here, thudding means low, dull sound of heart beating. Probably the dog was given care for the first time, and that is why poor dog put his paw on the hand of Mr. Harriet as he was examining dog.
I turned to Holiday. You know, Inspector, inside this bag of bones, there is a lovely golden retriever. I wish there was some way of letting him out. As I spoke, I noticed there was more than one figure in the door opening. A pair of black pebbles' eyes were peering intently at the dog from behind the inspector's back. The other spectators had remained in the lane, but Mrs. Donovan's curiosity had been too much for her. I continued conversationally as though I hadn't seen her. You know, what this dog needs first of all is a good shampoo to clean up his matted coat. Huh, said Halliday.
So, as Mr. Harriet, the vet, examined the dog, the inspector of RSPCA stood nearby him and watched him. And so Mr. Harriet turned to Halliday and said, "Sir, as this dog is not very old, inside this bag of bones there is lovely golden retriever." Here, bag of bones is an idiom, and it means that the dog has become so thin and weak that his bones are visible, though his bones are seen, but inside these bones, the fact that there is lovely golden retriever. Here, retriever means the dog will become large, lovely, golden colored dog. He said, if the dog was allowed to come out from this miserable condition, from this shed, he would have become large dog before only, but he had no chance to come out from here. As the author was talking to Halliday, he saw that there were many people who were in the opening door of cottages, but only one person, one figure, here figure means person, was looking at the poor dog from the behind the inspector's back. Children, remember, as the inspector and Mr. Harriet went to the shed to see the poor dog, Mr. Harriet had noticed Mr. Donovan as gnome-like brown face. Now we see that Mrs. Donovan was really present among those people who were hanging around there inside the cottages. Mr. Harriet saw that Mrs. Donovan showed her concern for that poor dog, but he continued to talk to Inspector. He behaved as though he had not seen Mrs. Donovan, but in fact he had seen her. But the fact is that he had noticed her. He noticed her that Mrs. Donovan was very curious to see the poor dog Roy. Still, Mr. Harriet continued to talk to Halliday as he examined the dog. he said to Inspector, "Sir, first, this dog needs good shampoo for cleaning up his coat." Here, coat means fur or hair of dog, which is very dirty. It is matted. Here, matted means a dried substance or mass is formed on dog's fur, on dog's hair. So, simple shampoo will not work. What does he need? He needs very good shampoo. Remember, still there is dialogue between Mr. Harriet, the veterinary surgeon, and the inspector of RSPCA. So, here Halliday, the inspector, agreed to provide good shampoo for the dog. Huh, said Halliday. It means he agreed to do so.
Yes, and then he wants a long course of some really strong condition powders. What's that? The inspector looked startled. There's no doubt about it, I said. It's the only hope for him. But where are you going to find such things? Really powerful enough. I mean, I sighed and straightened up. Well, I suppose there's nothing else for it. I would better put him to sleep right away. I'll get the things from my car. When I got back to the shed, Mrs. Donovan was already inside examining the dog.
Here, Mr. Harriet, the veterinary surgeon, knew what the poor dog was in need. What he needed, he knew it perfectly. So he said to Halliday, "Sir, the dog also needs strong condition powders, as his body is filled with wounds, very particularly his back." Probably the inspector had never heard about the condition powders. Listening this, he was shocked. He was startled, and that too it is to be given for a long time, nearly 2 to 3 months. Again, the Mr. Harriet said, "Sir, there is no doubt Roy will be perfectly well. Good dog shampoo and strong condition powders. These two things are only hope for the dog Roy. These two things are really very powerful stuff to heal the dog. But, sir, from where will you bring dog shampoo and condition powders? Do you have any idea about them? Do you know any medical where we can find these two things?" Mr. Harriet, as a vet, he knew where he could get these two things. Still, he questioned the Inspector Halliday. Mr. Harriet and the inspector were talking outside the shed, where dog was in sitting position. And then again Mr. Harriet went back to shed. He found that there was a strange lady, Mrs. Donovan, inside the shed. She was already examining the dog Roy without the permission of Harriet. Remember, children, Mrs. Donovan was a lady who could talk about the sickness of small animals for long hours. She had plenty of medicines for the dog who was sick and for treatment also. She was a generous and kind lady. The most significant thing that we know about Mrs. Donovan is that she was very famous for two things, that is, dog shampoo and condition powders. These two things of Mrs. Donovan did miracle in the town Derby, England. In the next video, we will see what is Mrs. Donovan going to do, whether she is given the dog Roy to her or someone else.